Welcome back, Health Impact audience. We're going to talk this afternoon with some experts around what are some of the big changes that have occurred on the technical side around many of the discussions that we've already had, because we're talking about remote care and this hybrid care. But this angle for the next 45 minutes or so is around cybersecurity, privacy, safety, and the risk associated with trying to do things rapidly. Many of you who have been in the IT industry have heard of this term called technical debt. Technical debt is when we make rapid decisions, knowing that in order to make a rapid decision and do something quickly, we might have to undo it later on or redo it later on. And then you pay a price to that, right? It's just like a regular debt that you take on. You're going to pay interest on that at some point, and then you have to pay it back. Well, similar to technical debt, I'm really excited to introduce our panel here who's going to talk about security debt. And some of that security debt it has been taken on primarily because of the pandemic, but other times we've done things like we're not sure what happens in the hybrid world, so we'll try something out and then see, if we can secure it. Sometimes you put in two-factor authentication, sometimes you go with zero trust, other times you do not. And so it's a really interesting topic, and that's what we're going to dive into really quickly. So Kimberly, would love to have you introduce yourself, and then we'll jump to Robert, Mitch, Dave, and then I'll give the first question out to Dave. So Kimberly.
I'm Kimberly Susi from Rochester Regional Health. I'm the Supervisor of Identity and Access Management, providing access to our various applications across the system, comprises 5 hospitals currently, and many more outpatient practices and clinics.
Awesome. Robert?
Yeah, my name is Robert Maines. I'm a security engineer at Catholic Health Systems. We're a system of about 12,000 employees, 6 acute sites, and many remote sites.
Excellent. Mitch?
So I'm Mitch Parker. I'm the Information Security Officer at Indiana University Health, the largest health system in the state of Indiana, with 17 hospitals and over 35,000 team members.
Awesome. Dave?
And I'm Dave Lewis, Global Advisory CISO for Duo Security, which is part of Cisco Systems. And I have been doing this for far longer than I care to admit.
You can tell with that great beard of yours, I'm jealous about it.
I needed some growth in my life.
Absolutely. So, you guys have coined this new terminology around security debt. So I'd love to just start with that. Like, what the heck is it? How do you define it? And is it start making sense to the customers that you're talking to? So talk a little bit about the background and let us know where it came from.
So oddly enough, this is a term that I've been using now since about 2013, when I gave my first talk on the subject of security debt and supply chain security issues at Trinity College in Dublin, and that was in 2013. So it's been an interesting road to get to where we are today. And one of the problems that I find with security in general is we usually need some sort of catalytic event for people to really take hold and take view of how to protect the environment. But when we look back from the healthcare perspective, we see things like we had SARS to contend with in 2003. Every environment has at least one beige desktop somewhere that's running mission critical software. And we also have scale issues that we have to contend with as well. So all of these are elements of a bigger conversation of the things that we have accepted the risk for, which were technical debt at one point in time, but over time, they've manifested into what I refer to as a security debt, where that technological debt has really compounded the problems. And to your point earlier, it really is about looking at it from the perspective of compound interest. The internet is, for want of a better term, the epitome of Frankenstein's monster. It is held together with baling wire and duct tape, and for whatever reason, it works. And along the way, there's a lot of different things that are attached to the networks that we have to be concerned about. And Heartbleed is a great example of this. Back in 2014, this was the SSL library had a vulnerability that was discovered that had been in the code for 2 years. The problem here is basically every organization on the planet was using this library. Unfortunately, the team that was used to maintaining it was, I think it was 2 people at the time, and they had no funding to speak of. So this is a real Achilles heel that unfortunately got exploited. And my concern is that in other parts of the businesses, other parts of healthcare organizations, we really do have to worry about, the what's next aspect of things, as was, demonstrated in the news in the past months.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And when you think about security debt and some of the things you're doing to take on that debt, Kimberly, I'd love for you to jump in and tell us, especially because you have this very operational role. You're not dealing with high-level thought leadership, et cetera. You're in there with people who cannot get into their systems because they're miles away from where they used to be before. Tell us the stories around what has been going on, the reality on the ground. Have things been much worse than you expected, much better than you expected, about the same? And how are you working with Duo Security to help you at your facility?
It's actually been a lot better than anticipated because we had made that investment in 2FA years prior, and many of the people who were already working partially remote were accustomed to that technology, and we had our processes in place where we could rapidly deploy that remote access to a large group of people and have them comfortable with it. We did have to look more at enforcing, our different employment types and making sure that we were providing the best access based on job role. But overall, we ramped up very quickly to a fully remote workforce, except for our bedside people. And with very few pain points, because we already had our VPN in place, and we already had our VPN secured. We already had our Citrix environment secured. And I think we impressed a lot of people by how quickly we deployed their access and made them log in and be able to do what they needed to do.
And what's surprising about that is that you're able to do that with two-factor authentication. I've actually seen in the last year people take on this, Dave's security debt by just saying, this is too hard to do remotely, so we're just going to take away two-factor and we'll just go back to single-factor. But that is awesome news that you did not have to do that. Not only did you not have to do it, but that wasn't part of your plan, right? You want to do it securely and remotely. Exactly. So that's great to hear. Robert, on your side, how has the zero trust, two-factor authentication, et cetera, fit in your environment? And did you guys have to take on any security debt during the pandemic or near there?
Yeah, absolutely. For us, there was a lot of very expedited and time-sensitive changes we had to make for everything from remote access, method changes, new telehealth systems, all came in really quick. So we tried to introduce compensating controls whenever we could. Multi-factor authentication was a big one. Network segmentation definitely plays into that zero trust idea. Luckily, we already had a lot of that framework in place that enable us to move quickly with those changes.
And what I want the audience to understand is that it's okay that you do take on some technical debt and security debt. Just be ready to pay it back, right? What kills you with the debt of any kind, especially a financial debt, is if you kind of take the debt and you forget about it. That compound interest, like Dave said, is growing and it's accumulating. And at some point, you're going to have to pay it. You're going to have to throw away a system, et cetera. So, Robert, I'm glad to hear that you guys did not have to jump in either. Mitch, any stories where you had to take on any security debt during this pandemic?
I will tell you the big issue that every organization had was the relaxation of telehealth enforcement for using non-certified platforms during your pandemic led to a number of organizations having to use multiple platforms. And so with each telehealth platform you support, it comes with a supporting process, which means that it's not just someone logging on and doing telehealth visits. There's a whole back-end revenue cycle piece as well. There's billing, there's coding, there's making sure that the entire medical staff knows how to support it. And literally taking everything you could and making it work was a significant challenge. And when you compound it with the issue that a number of cloud service providers had significant scalability issues during the first few weeks of the pandemic, then it adds up to having some pretty significant challenges, because you would have to get providers using certain telehealth platforms, not because you wanted to support these platforms, but because you had to get them to work. But the most important thing that an organization can do is plan to get rid of them. As soon as you plan for a system, you plan for its end of life.
Mhm.
So end of life planning starts the day the system goes live. Because if you don't do that, you will incur technical debt, you will incur security debt, and you're going to have one-off systems that are going to stretch your resources to the point where you can't innovate. So it's been a significant challenge simply because of the relaxation regulation coupled with the scalability issues during the first few weeks.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so, Dave, you, of course, from your perch at Cisco and Duo Security specifically, you see things across customers. Would you say that what you've heard from Mitch and Robert and Kimberly is about on par for most customers, or are these guys more advanced and there are others taking on more technical debt and security debt that they should be afraid of? And that point that Mitch made is so valid in that, you need to have, when you get onto the on-ramp, you need to know where your exit's going to come from. So have your exit strategy and your data strategy done. What, from a security perspective, should we be thinking about, when you think across all of these different companies, are they thinking through that differently during the pandemic? Or what do you see and what do you advise them?
So before I ever got into the vendor space, I spent 20 years on the other side of the phone. So I have been down this road as a defender. And a lot of the times organizations don't do exactly what Mitch pointed out of, planning for its end of life. When a project is put in place, far too often there's never a thought given to how this is going to end. And then we look at things like, for example, with IoT, you have all these consumer grade applications that are ending up in hospitals, ending up in homes and things like that have planned obsolescence built into them and no way to manage them or protect them. So I do see this a fair bit where organizations are not figuring out how to handle this. And this is not to disparage them, because any organization that's older than 2 weeks has some level of technical debt in their organization. It just, this is how it works. As soon as you buy a system, it's like buying a car. The second you drive it off the lot, it starts depreciating right away. And with organizations switching over, like these panelists here, they did a bang up job getting things done. But I've also talked to organizations that weren't so fortunate. They didn't have the resources to be able to support their remote employees, and they had to make risk-based decisions that hopefully they're going to track to end of job using a risk register, because if they're not, this exactly is the problem where it can boil back up again. One call center I know of in Southeast Asia, they had no laptops for any of their staff, so they sent all of the desktops home with their employees. So while I understand the need to keep the lights on and keep things humming along, that could have potentially exposed them to some very significant issues further down the road.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great thing to point out. And Robert, if you can jump in and talk about from a day-to-day security engineer perspective, what are you guys seeing during the pandemic? And now if you start planning, a year out, what are you seeing differently about your job that will not change after the pandemic as well?
Yeah, so for us, the change was really just the surprises, new systems coming on board very rapidly, and the entire field changing quickly. So, we had the new telehealth service that I mentioned earlier coming on board. That was really a scramble to collect all the security information we could about that company, about securing the application quickly enough. So as a result, we've brought on a new process to kind of automate that, where we gather information about vendors, new applications, and make sure we're doing a thorough process right at the beginning, and that it's all documented in a way that we can follow up later on. So that's something we're really happy about that's going to stick around.
That's good. And were you using any tools that you want to talk about? Any resources that you want to mention? If you can think of any, that's always good to talk about, because our audiences here are mostly doers and not just thinkers. So any resources that you'd like to point out, any companies that you might have used that might fare well for the audience as well?
Not specifics, I can't get into specifics, but in general, it was really helpful to move from we had a lot of disparate on-premise documentation, time tracking systems that there just wasn't any consistency. Everybody was going all over the place for information. So one of the biggest positive things we saw come out of this past year was we very quickly had to focus on hosted services is where we ended up. Yeah. So everybody knows what the one source of truth of where to get documentation, make documentation, track our projects, and collaborate as well was another big one.
Good. So just you're suggesting that the more you can move into the cloud, the more agility it'll buy you. So that makes a ton of sense. Kimberly and Mitch, I'd love for you to comment on the idea of observability of the system. And when people are in the office, there's a natural tendency to say you have a better idea of what's going on because you can see things. If nobody's in the office, what is going on and how do you do observability? So can you talk from an operational perspective, Kimberly? How do you know what's going on? Who's logging in, who's not? When are they logging out? Logging in when they're not supposed to be? What's the observability strategy?
We've seen a lot of increase, of course, in our SIM reporting and things like that, where we can track those events. It is kind of a downside to not be able to just walk around and see who's here, who's not. But we're pretty standardized on our different platforms. Everyone knows, everyone can access the same email client, the same, they're logging into the same domain primarily. And it's not really been that, we're used to just reaching out and sending an instant message, sending an email, keeping in track with people. And in touch with people that way. And we don't know. One of the things we discovered is where people are printing. We didn't know. There were a lot of documents that we didn't know about that were floating around that we had to track and make sure they were being securely destroyed if needed. That people were instructed in document handling outside of an office setting. So that was one concern that popped up. But aside from that, I think we're still very in touch with each other, although we don't meet for coffee as often.
Sure. Mitch, same question for you. Observability, it's been one of those things that I'm looking at across customers that we work with and are finding that many of them are not finding it as easy as Kimberly is to see what's going on. And because they don't know what's going on and what the remote world is really like, they're struggling with that level of observability and how much reporting is good and where the compliance comes in. Are you also struggling with that? And then Dave, you can jump in from a more industry perspective as well.
I don't look at this as a technical problem. I look at this as more of a management issue because we've done a pretty good job of replacing what was a lot of meetings with a lot of teleconferencing. We have a lot of the same meetings. We have actually a little bit easier time communicating because we have groupware and instant messaging, and a lot of things that were at one time phone conversations are now instant messages. So it's actually improved communication in that way. However, it's a management challenge because while you have the appearance of togetherness with people in a workforce, they are not sitting together anymore. They are working remotely and people feel isolated. People feel alone. And it takes a lot more effort on the part of management to make them not feel alone. Because observability, there's the component of it where people think, yeah, you can see what they're doing. We've known what people are doing in systems for years. They all log accesses. We all know who did what. That's not the question. The question is, how are we as managers able to make sure our teams are okay? How are we able to make sure they're doing well? Because everyone's not okay. And I don't think people say enough about that part. So there's that part where you can walk up to someone when you're walking around the office to see if they're okay or not. You can't do that anymore. And it's more about making sure you're around to make sure people are able to reach out and say they're not okay, than it is anything technical.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And when you think about it that way, Mitch, are you opening your doors as virtual doors, as it were, to non-staff from within your own business unit? Do you mean like you're looking at it organization-wide or primarily focused on your own business unit?
I open up to everyone because the deal is my entire business is based upon my customer's ability to call me up. And if I can't do that, and if I'm not effective at doing that, especially now, then I'm worthless.
Yeah. No, I see that that point exactly. So one thing we're mentioning about observability is also because, like, if in a physical meeting, often you can be sitting around a table before the meeting starts. There's a little bit of chatter going on. After the meeting ends, you can go. Two people can step outside and say, "Hey, what are you doing with that? Why is it so damn hard to log into the system? And how are you making sure that your card works everywhere?" And people give each other tips and tricks. And well, you know, those little isolated calls, maybe they're happening more through messaging, et cetera. But that's the thing I think is most dangerous from a security perspective. I think everything you said, Mitch, from a human work-a-day perspective is important, because security, the weakest chain in security is us as humans, right? It's not the technology, as you mentioned. And now, related to that, you know, Robert made a great point about, if you move more into the cloud, you're going to be more agile. You can potentially get more and more security done. If we talk about these two things, zero trust and moving to the cloud together, is that a solution, Dave, to push further faster, so that the observability, like the observability in a zero trust environment, is far greater than you're going to get in a non-zero trust environment? Observability when things are in the cloud are a little bit easier because the tools, et cetera, are there. Do you buy that argument, or should we pull back on anything that is going cloud-wise because of some new dangers that maybe we're not thinking about?
No, I think it makes a lot of sense to look at moving towards cloud. And to go back to echo, you know, Mitch's statement there, I mean, the human element is something that is unfortunately overlooked far too often in a lot of organizations. And that is a key element of any security program for an organization. If you are, you know, having a security awareness program, you want to make sure you're gamifying it, so you're making them engaged into the, you know, protecting the organization as a whole. And when you look at the transition from, you know, the hub and spoke brick and mortar routine to cloud-based or hybrid, or however, whatever makes the most sense for your particular organization, a lot of times the cost discussion is going to win overall. And when you are able to spin up resources, spin down, and scale as needed, without having to build out all of the physical infrastructure, that really does have a huge benefit there. And it frees up a lot of resources to be able to concentrate on other things, to make sure that, you know, you're improving patient care, you're improving interaction with your staff, and, you know, making sure that you are there as a champion for the organization. Because historically, love it or hate it, security folks have been seen as the flaming sword of justice, and, you know, how do we get to the answer being no?
Right.
And that's a deprecated notion. We really have to be seen as the adult in the room. And I think that this unfortunate situation we find ourselves in has really afforded us the possibility to step up and to reach out to our staff, to be proactive across the board. And I think that this is going to be hugely beneficial, and especially when we pivot towards the cloud, where we can be more nimble and focus more resources on our staff, I think that's a huge win as well. But zero trust is fundamentally about reducing risk of the organization, reducing costs, and basically having a better night's sleep.
Yeah, and I think that when you think about the, I love what you said with the thought process that we put in right now, especially around zero trust and cloud. If we can say that they are more secure, not less secure, and because they're more secure, they're actually less costly, then I think we're making some really good headway. Now, in order to do this, there's a lot of planning and activity that has to happen. So in the last few minutes before we open it up for questions, Kimberly, I'd love for you to start us off with a discussion around what are the specific defined and repeatable processes and action plans and other things that you're putting in with respect to a level of sophistication around process? Or did you just say, look, right now, process is pretty much out the window and there's not much we can do? Specifically to Dave's point, which was, if you are the Department of No before the pandemic, you are the department of I don't care what you say anymore during the pandemic, right? Because nobody actually cared whether it was secure or not. It was now, I'm doing this, please find a way to secure it. Not, let me know if this is secure and then maybe we'll do it, right? So you went from a department of almost always being looked at to say, oh, they can stop me, from it don't matter no more, right? So we went to two extremes. So Kimberly, talk a little bit about where does planning and proper decision-making fit into the modern world, especially during the pandemic?
I mean, we have a very good risk analysis and compliance team that any new application or new process really needs to go through that risk analysis. And people are now accustomed to going through that level of testing and verification of different downstream systems. We're moving currently to Azure Active Directory and Office 365. Those plans haven't stopped despite the pandemic. So we're looking at security for the most part. We get that involved in the first part of the planning stages. I think security has come a long way, and that there's a lot more visibility in the C-suite for what security means and what benefits it can bring, for cost savings. We don't want $1 million penalties. We don't want those sort of things. We would like to address those concerns before progressing down the line of, project implementation. So security always has a look at things before we start implementing. And I think that's been very beneficial. We've also had, we've had our phishing campaigns and our different things that the security has kicked off, where we kind of quiz people. They get little pop-ups and they're, oh, nope, shouldn't have clicked that link. So there, and security communications have been enhanced during this time. So, I think security is a lot more visible.
That's great.
These days than it was even before the pandemic.
Robert, on your side, as you think about what Kimberly was saying, do you find it that your experience was characterized in the way that I'm saying is people just told you, here, we're doing this, go find a way to secure it? Or do you feel like you were in the process to pick the proper tools, et cetera, as you would have been pre-pandemic?
We definitely got a little bit of both. So for us, it was just about having a lot of tools in your belt to quickly adapt, a lot of compensating controls to throw in if this doesn't work, that doesn't work. That's what really got us through it.
And do you feel that, let's say in 2022 or 2023, you've learned some stuff here where you can say, you know what, maybe we were being a little overzealous on certain things in the past, and we should be more nimble, more agile on the security side, because if you're going to the cloud a little bit now, it's going to be even more so, 2 years from now. Is there anything that you've learned that you think you're going to be taking forward from reducing the burden on people coming to you with systems that they want to deploy?
Yeah, I think we're a lot more equipped to be reactive. So it's not about offering less security to get things put in. It's just about knowing what options we have and really focusing the efforts on certain technologies, so we have a repeatable process to bring those new surprises in quickly.
No, that makes sense. And Mitch, so as you think about the big problem areas in security, I think you and I are in agreement, because we've talked about this before, is the human element is a major, major component. But if you were just to pick a couple of technical topics, what are the things that you're focused on over the next year that other audience members should also be looking at from a pure technology perspective?
So the big thing that we need to focus on is moving to the cloud does not solve your problems. A matter of fact, we believe that moving to the cloud makes you really have to think and plan a lot more. While the cloud does a great job of mitigating security risk, because let's face it, Amazon's got thousands of engineers, you don't. They're going to do security better than you ever will. The cloud providers are very inflexible. And a lot of the shortcuts that at one time we took in the past to get systems up and running or get processes in place, we're not able to do those anymore. Those days of customizing are done. So we have to put a lot more thought into the processes that we use, and also what happens when the cloud's not there, into our downtime procedures and processes. So again, when you take a look at the cloud, don't think it's a panacea. Think of it as you have to be very introspective about the processes that you have within your organization, because they will change, because the cloud is not going to change for you.
Yeah, it's a great, that's such great advice, Mitch. And Dave, we'll let you take us home before we go into the Q&A period with two topics. One is anything else you want to say about security debt with respect to both the pandemic and even going forward, and then kind of like tying that up and saying, well, here are a couple of takeaways that you're working on, you know, from the Cisco and the Duo perspective across customers. What are you suggesting that they work on a pure technical perspective over the next 12 to 18 months?
Well, I mean, when we're talking about security debt, just organizations have to understand it exists and not to be afraid of it, but learn how to manage it. And good ways to tackle this are looking at things like having a risk register. Defined repeatable processes are a really good thing. Like look at ITIL as an example. I was able to, be in an organization where we had no new projects for an entire calendar year. We rolled out ITIL to the entire industry. I wish, entire business, and we were able to reduce our rate of incidents by 76% in the first 3 months. So it was, something that we were able to show demonstrably it would work. And Mitch is right. Cloud is not a panacea. It's not magic, pixie dust. You're going to sprinkle on your servers and everything's just going to work, because you have to do a proper mapping, proper planning in order to ensure that when you go to the cloud, that it is going to work, because he's absolutely right. It's not a magical lift and shift. It's not just going to work. And that's just it. A lot of times we have applications that we have written that, yes, they worked in tests, they worked in our own production environment, but you'll find firewall rules of any, and things like that. And these are the things that we have to be concerned about when we move to, a multi-tenancy environment, as an example. Now, from protecting things going long-term, you want to look at, zero trust, or a better way to approach it is a continuous trusted access, so that we're verifying all the users, all the devices that are attaching to our network, and all the applications that we need in order to keep the lights on. So if we are making sure we're protecting those 3 buckets, we're fundamentally putting all of our security issues into one of those 3 buckets and being able to manage it for the workplace, the workforce, and the workload, and ensuring that any risks that we've accepted in the past are managed. A risk register, which I mentioned earlier, is fundamental. And if you have that, you can track your risks, you can have visibility for that in senior management. And when the auditors come calling, you're able to demonstrate to them what your work plan is to get to end of job, to make sure that these risks are not remaining untested.
Yeah, and I think that and you mentioned risk register a few times, and please, people should reach out to Dave and team to ask, well, what the heck is a risk register? Could you show me an example? And that would be a great conversation to have, because it is one of those things where, Robert mentioned things like compensating controls. So these are things that already exist. Many libraries, you can get them open source, et cetera, but that'd be a great question to just send to Dave and say, hey, we'd love to work with you on a risk register. How could we do that? Now with that, I'm going to turn it over to the audience. Please ask some tough questions. One question we could start off with would be, does anyone have any questions around the SolarWinds attack in the supply chain for other industries that you've already seen? And in the medical industry, of course, we have a big problem with supply chain on both the medical device side, as well as our normal IT and all this cloud stuff that we're doing. So, we didn't jump into it too much here because I wanted to focus a little bit on the higher level. But if that's a question that you'd like to ask, this would be a great time to ask it of the panelists. So with that, I'd love to thank Kimberly, Robert, Dave, Mitch for giving us your excellent advice, and we'll open it up to the audience now. All right, welcome everybody. Let's see if anybody asks about the SolarWinds, or if anybody wants to talk about the Microsoft Exchange massive security problem. Those are worth talking about. So, Mitch, Robert, Kimberly, anybody want to talk about either SolarWinds or the Microsoft problem before we jump into the other questions?
I can hit on the Exchange.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so
first, can you describe it just in case people don't know, just to give a 30-second background on it, and then what you guys are doing?
Yeah, so it was found recently that there was an open vulnerability that if you were running on-prem Exchange with Outlook web access open up to the outside world, you basically had an open door ready for somebody to come knock on, and anywhere from reading mailboxes to getting network-wide access was possible with that. it was definitely a scary thing. I think it got us looking at how to better protect from things like that in the future. You know, obviously you can't have everything patched for 0 days, but one of the things that stood out to me was the importance of traffic decryption, and really being able to get a fine-grained look at everything going in and out of your network, so that you can apply, exploit controls, data loss controls, system-wide, and not have to rely on patches to get released to cover you.
No, that's a great point. And Mitch, I'd love for you to comment on, data loss prevention in general. And during the talk, you mentioned, cloud is not a panacea, but cloud makes the data loss prevention even a little bit harder because the networks are detached from what your primary network would have been, and more remote makes data loss prevention that much harder. So if you can give if you want to say anything about the Microsoft Exchange problem in specific, that's great. Otherwise, can you broaden it a little bit more? What is your data loss prevention strategy, and how are you adopting to the cloud, stretching the network, as it were, to make that harder or easier?
Well, I can take this as a two-part answer for you. So number one, talking about the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability, there were 4 vulnerabilities that were part of this latest amount of emergency patching that organizations are undertaking. And the first one was the most critical because it allowed you to run any code in any context on Exchange server, which meant that organizations that had already had issues with attacks like SolarWinds, there was suddenly a new avenue in for them to go in and plunder the insides of corporate networks, which, to my understanding, has already happened to several. Mm-hmm. So what's dangerous about Exchange is that it provided a very easy way for people to get inside corporate networks, run their own code, and therefore do a lot more second stage damage. So that's very important. But when it comes to the cloud, and you talk about data loss prevention, while you have your on-premises that you have to worry about, when you get to the cloud, you have to be more worried about identity-based. And what I mean by that is that you don't have a network anymore. Your access and your entitlement is based upon who you are, and hopefully strong identity proofing controls. And so you have to put in systems that take a look at that and see what the identity is doing and what the identity is transferring over. And that's going to take organizations a long time to be able to do. And I sadly can't comment on what IU Health is doing in that regard. However, I can tell you that organizations in general, and this is exactly what Microsoft is pushing amongst others, is more of an identity-based approach to cloud access and data loss prevention.
Yeah, no, I love that guidance. So Kimberly, talk a little bit about the Microsoft attack plus the SolarWinds, and does that put more fear into you to say, you know what, we have got to get rid of all of our internal stuff faster so we can get out into the cloud? Or does it make you think differently to say, well, we still need some things on-prem because even though these kind of attacks occur, we have more control over them? And just as a quick reminder, what we've heard, at least from Microsoft and others, is that the Office 365 Live, Microsoft Exchange Online did not have these same issues, but on-prem servers, et cetera, did. So does this mean we should be looking to get the heck off of on-prem email, et cetera, as fast as we can? Or let's temper this because, stuff like this has happened in the past and we need to cover it, but not look for a wholesale migration. Kimberly, you're on mute.
And, am I?
No, you're fine now.
Okay. Primarily what we're seeing is our existing project that we did have underway to migrate a lot of those applications to the cloud. A little extra push behind those, try to get them in. We want a firm go live date and better structure around that plan, and trying to ramp that up a little bit quicker than we were with the knowledge that we are going to keep many things on. There are lots of in-house things that we control, but we still need to make sure that they are updated, that they are visible and well reported on. And that's always been the realization. So how are we going to treat those on-prem applications and stay really on top of what security vulnerabilities they might have? I don't think that's really changed that much since we have had this long-running project to move more into the cloud.
Cool. Yeah, that's good to hear. And so for Mitch, what I'd love to ask you to maybe summarize for us is, what is your strategy from a cybersecurity for medical devices, especially as devices are getting more and more connected, and you're not going to just move all the devices into the cloud. So that is an on-prem, almost forever problem. So I just love for you to kind of like kick that off. And then Robert, from a security engineering point of view, what do you see on the medical device cybersecurity side that Mitch sets up here? And then Kimberly, I'll let you loop that in as well.
So I'm going to set this up a little bit by saying everything old becomes new again. You remember back in 1989, what was called the Morris worm that took down the internet back in the late 80s?
Yep.
You remember what caused it? It was a vulnerability in SendMail.
Yeah.
So everything old becomes new again. And sadly, we're using a lot of the old with our medical devices. So the strategy of med device security is you've got to catalog, understand the capabilities of, and effectively contain the devices you have, and make sure you plan around them. Again, this is what I've publicly said for years. You're never going to eliminate vulnerabilities. You're never going to eliminate risk. It's how you manage it, especially with these devices. And you have to make sure that these devices are operational and available in whatever capacity, because you're not getting security patches the way a Windows desktop is, because you don't want to put a patch on and hope that it works. Yeah, if somebody says, I'm going to put this on, hope that it works, and then proceed to perform a procedure on me, we're going to have some trouble. So that is my strategy. But again, everything old becomes new again, and I don't think people are talking about the Morris worm in the context of what went on this past week enough.
No, you're exactly right. And Mitch, just can you also elaborate a little bit on, in general, do you think that the connected medical device manufacturers are doing a reasonable job, piss poor job, better job than you thought that they might, just to give us a sense of where you think that might fit and how much they should care about cybersecurity?
I think the medical device manufacturers have really improved how they address cybersecurity. I am in regular contact with several of these companies. I have spoken to their engineering teams. They really do care, because ultimately, if you take a look at it, no one wants to be the med device vendor that has a device fail because of a cybersecurity incident, because that's damaging. People trust these devices. Doctors trust these devices. And if a cyber attack happens to a medical device, it causes people to lose trust and credibility in the device and the manufacturer. Nobody wants that. And least of all, no one wants to ever think of doing that to a patient. So the medical device companies have really stepped up their game. I am thankful to deal with the people in the med device companies that I deal with, because they really have improved.
That's great to hear. Robert, your thoughts on med devices on cybersecurity, and how serious you have to take it, either because your vendors that you're working with are not taking it seriously enough, or for any other reason?
Yeah, I think it's a constant moving target for us in a lot of organizations. So what we've found is a lot of the vendors are very good at staying on top of patching, moving to updated systems, but there's a lot that push it back on us as the customer to say, hey, we have a patch, but you have to pay a lot of money for it. And that just becomes an impossible business situation where the security's out there, but it's just not budgeted. You know, a lot of times we don't find out about it until it's an issue and we need to do something right away. And the other problem we found is it's just really hard to track medical devices. They don't have a consistent thumbprint, set of credentials that you can do vulnerability scanning with. So across the board, it's just surprise after surprise. Really, our approach has just been segmentation. When we find something, when we know a new system's coming in, segment it so that if it does become a risk, or it is a risk, it's at least a contained risk within itself, and we can monitor traffic in and out. So that does go back to the zero trust idea. And so far, it's worked for us. There's, of course, some hesitation. You're talking medical device. You're talking patient care. Somebody's, life on the line, a lot of money on the line, and it's taken a lot of buy-in. We found that forming a really good relationship with our biomedical teams and leadership have been key to it, so that we can build that trust and they understand the process we want to go through. Understand the risk and reward to it, and ultimately the cost saving is what it comes down to.
Great. No, that's a great summary. So Kimberly, we're out of time, but if there's anything else you want to add about the medical devices, because they're pretty serious, is there anything you want to add to what Mitch and Robert was mentioning?
Not particularly. I mean, one thing we have done, I think, a little bit better that we've improved on is looking not only at the relationship between us and these vendor companies that are supplying these devices, but what other relationships they have, and what are they importing vulnerabilities into the system that could then flow through to us. So it's really looking at kind of a web of access into our system. I don't want something coming in from a vendor company's HVAC system or something.
Sure.
Like that. Yeah.
Great points. Well, thank you so much for you guys joining us live here as well. Kimberly, Robert, Mitch, and Dave was unable to join us in those last couple of minutes. He had to get shuttled off to another important meeting, but we will cover a great set of topics in our next session. So if you please join us in the closing session and the closing keynote of the day, that would be great. Again, thank you all for joining here, and please join us at the next session.
Thank you, Shaheen.
Thanks a lot.